Well, the fight against Myanmar's military coup is escalating. Earlier today, insurgents attacked an army outpost near the Thailand border. Protests and violent clashes with security forces have been going on since February, when the military overthrew the democratically elected government. Some in Washington are pushing for sanctions on Myanmar, and the New York Times reports that Chevron is lobbying against them. So Lara Jakes, is a diplomatic correspondent for the New York Times, and she helped write the article, and she's here to talk a little bit more about this. So this is going to be something very new for people. Tell them exactly what Chevron is doing in Myanmar, why it's so important for them to remain in business there, and tell us about their lobbying efforts to discourage any sanctions that might get in the way of business.
Sure. Thanks for having me on. First, to just kind of unpack the history a little bit, one of the main beneficiaries of Myanmar's military in years past has been Burma's oil and gas industry. There have been some estimates that the Yadana oil field, which I think your map shows is located off of Myanmar's southern coast, something like 70% of its proceeds go to Myanmar's military. In years past, that's amounted to at least $1 billion or more going directly from this oil field to the oil and gas industry for the country, and then that goes on and funds the Myanmar military. The Biden administration is very worried right now that this money and other industries that fund Myanmar's military will be used to further oppression in the country. We've seen at least 700 people have been killed since the junta took control on February 1st. The Biden administration declared that this was a coup on February 2nd. It was one of President Biden's first foreign policy decisions to make. And the sanctions essentially, the purpose would be to further squeeze the junta, try to stop using that money to further oppression. And it's created quite a debate in the Biden administration, in some part because of this lobbying effort by Chevron. Chevron invested in the Yadana oil field in 2005. They make about $150 million a year, at least, in proceeds from the Yadana oil field.
So this talk of imposing sanctions against Myanmar, explain to our audience who's pushing for those and what would the sanctions seek to do?
The sanctions would basically squeeze the Myanmar oil and gas industry. It would not allow the proceeds to go to the people who basically profit off of the oil and gas industry. That would mean no money for the junta. It would also mean no money for Chevron. And again, the administration is trying to cut off any kind of profits that could be used to further the crackdown on the Burmese people. So the other side of the debate that Chevron has been making, and there is a following of this stream of thought in the Biden administration, that if you cut off the oil and gas industry, that may cut off electricity for many, many millions of people in not just Myanmar, but also in neighboring Thailand, which also receives some of the gas from Yadana. And so could this, in essence, spark another humanitarian disaster? People need electricity to keep their water clean, to keep their food fresh. So there's some concern that if MOGI, the Myanmar oil and gas industry, is sanctioned, that this could spark another humanitarian disaster. And that's one reason why the Biden administration is struggling.
So, this coup, though, has been going on now for months. It would seem like striking the oil and gas industry would be the swiftest, most devastating way to make the military reconsider what they're doing. Clearly, the sanctions that have been occurring, or the actions, I don't know if they're sanctions that have been occurring so far, haven't been working. What has the U.S. been doing?
There's been kind of a series of sanctions. First, the Biden administration sanctioned the generals themselves, anybody who could use their assets to further crack down on Myanmar's people. They limited travel for the generals and people who had overthrown Aung San Suu Kyi and Myanmar's more democratically elected government. Last week, we saw more sanctions against the pearl and timber industries in Myanmar. Again, these industries were helping fund the junta. They go to the government. The government now is the junta. So any money that the pearl and the timber industries in Myanmar was making off of their exports essentially went to the junta. But you're right that this would be sanctions against the oil and gas industry in Myanmar, which is one of its largest industries, would be a huge blow to the junta and the money that it relies on to stay afloat.
Yeah, and Lara, it's not always clear that in cases like this that sanctions actually work. They can have the opposite effect, in fact, when you really sort of cut off the only viable economic driver in a particular country, especially one that is, poor. That can have serious repercussions on. I mean, it looks bad now, but it can go pear-shaped very quickly.
That's certainly what many people in Venezuela have been saying, for example, right? There was this pressure campaign by the former administration, the Trump administration, to try to oust Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela, from power starting in 2019. And we saw this ratcheting up of sanctions, not just against Maduro, but expanding out to so many of Venezuela's industries as well. And that has the argument has been that the sanctions have contributed to the humanitarian disaster that we now see in Venezuela, where people can't get medicine, that people are starving, where jobs are very, very scarce, if at all possible. Of course, the government would say, and I think not just the Trump administration, but also the Biden administration would say that it was President Maduro's own actions that led to the humanitarian disaster that we now see in Venezuela, that have contributed to a huge refugee crisis in Venezuela and in South America. We are now also seeing tens of thousands of displaced people in Myanmar. So yes, the argument can be made that with more sanctions, you just exacerbate what is already a disaster. The flip side of that, of course, is without sanctions, this regime that has killed 700 people, that has detained some 3,400 government officials in Myanmar and led to already the exodus of tens of thousands of people, remain unchecked and just stay in power.
Yeah, I mean, what's been happening so far clearly isn't working. So how is Chevron responding to your reporting? How is Chevron defending itself? Other than to say what you sort of pointed out, which was, hey, we help an awful lot of people, and imagine all the people who would suffer if these sanctions are, all the regular people who would suffer if you implement these sanctions. What else are they saying?
I mean, that is the main argument that they make. It's the one that resonates most clearly with the State Department and with the Biden administration, which is so focused on trying to alleviate humanitarian disasters or human rights abuses. But they also have some personal stake in this as well. Again, $150 million a year is kind of, chump change for Chevron. But they say that if the sanctions come on and the Adana field essentially goes quiet, not only could it create this humanitarian disaster, not only could it cut off oil and gas for many millions of people, but at some point in the future, when Adana is allowed to come back online, that it could severely hamper those production efforts. So they're saying that this is not just a short-term fix, but this could have ramifications for years to come.
Lara Jakes, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.